Diplomatic liaison officer David Park arrived at the Nexus arbitration platform with the kind of professional caution that came from 2 years of facilitating negotiations between species that viewed each other with barely controlled hostility. The neutral space station existed in the void between human and Vorthak territories. Its modular architecture, deliberately designed to avoid favoring either civilization's aesthetic preferences, while providing the secure environment necessary for discussions that could either prevent or trigger interstellar warfare. Remember, Ambassador Williams had briefed him during the shuttle approach. Your job is to facilitate communication without becoming part of the conversation. The ceasefire extension negotiations are too important to risk complications from personal relationships or cultural misunderstandings that could give either side excuses to walk away from the table. Facilitate without participating. Understood, David had replied, though privately he wondered whether successful diplomacy between species required the kind of emotional distance that often made negotiations feel more like elaborate dances around truth rather than honest attempts to find common ground. The Vorthak delegation had arrived 3 days earlier, led by Queen Zelara Nithenden, whose reputation for strategic brilliance was matched only by her commitment to policies that prioritized long-term stability over short-term military advantage. The Vorthak looked almost human, except for the pointed ears that marked them as something else, and the luminous skin markings that shifted patterns based on emotional states that David's briefings described as culturally significant social communication, requiring careful interpretation. David's assignment placed him in the unique position of observing all interactions between delegations, while providing cultural guidance that could prevent innocent misunderstandings from escalating into diplomatic crises. The work required constant vigilance combined with professional invisibility, being present enough to intervene when necessary while remaining sufficiently detached to avoid influencing outcomes through personal bias or emotional investment. The Vorthak practiced something called truth bonding, Dr. Sarah Chen, the xenocultural specialist, had explained during his preparation briefings. Certain expressions of sincere intention or emotional honesty can activate ancient laws that create permanent connections between individuals. Any suggestion that negotiations are being influenced by personal relationships rather than objective evaluation could invalidate whatever agreements might be reached. What kind of personal relationships? Any kind. The Vorthak don't distinguish between professional cooperation and personal affection when evaluating the authenticity of diplomatic commitments. They believe that lasting peace requires genuine emotional investment, but they also recognize that such investment can compromise the neutrality necessary for fair negotiation. David had spent the journey to the Nexus platform studying Vorthak cultural protocols, trying to understand the complex balance between emotional authenticity and diplomatic objectivity that would be required for successful facilitation of negotiations that represented both species' best hope for avoiding a war that could consume entire star systems. The negotiation chambers themselves were marvels of neutral design, spaces that accommodated the ceremonial requirements of both cultures, while maintaining the kind of formal atmosphere that encouraged careful consideration of proposals whose implications would affect billions of lives. Queen Zelara presided over the Vorthak delegation with the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding submission, displaying both royal authority and evident intelligence as she evaluated human proposals with focused attention that suggested genuine interest in finding workable solutions. The territorial boundaries proposed in Section 7 require clarification. Queen Zelara observed during the second day's sessions, her voice carrying the formal courtesy that characterized diplomatic discourse, while her luminous markings shifted through patterns that David was learning to interpret as thoughtful analysis rather than emotional reaction. We're prepared to provide additional detail about resource allocation and administrative oversight, replied Ambassador Williams, though David noted that the response avoided addressing the specific concerns the Queen had raised about enforcement mechanisms and dispute resolution procedures. David found himself increasingly impressed by Queen Zelara's approach to the negotiations. Her questions demonstrated comprehensive understanding of both the technical details and broader implications of proposed agreements, while her suggestions often identified creative solutions that served both species' interests more effectively than the zero-sum alternatives that dominated most diplomatic discussions. The problem was that his professional admiration for the Queen's intelligence and dedication was becoming complicated by personal attraction that he was certain would compromise his ability to provide neutral facilitation if other negotiators became aware of it. The Queen has been asking about your background and perspectives on human cultural priorities, Dr. Chen mentioned during one of their evening briefings. She seems particularly interested in your opinions about the relationship between individual commitment and institutional policy. I hope you emphasize that my role is technical facilitation rather than policy advocacy, David replied, though he was aware that his responses to the Queen's questions had probably revealed more about his personal views than strict professional neutrality would recommend. I emphasized appropriate protocol boundaries, yes, though I should mention that Queen Zelara's interest in your perspectives appears to be based on intellectual curiosity rather than romantic attraction, if that distinction affects your approach to future interactions. David wasn't entirely certain that the distinction was as clear as Dr. Chen suggested, or that his own reactions to the Queen's attention were based purely on professional appreciation for her diplomatic skills. The growing awareness that he was beginning to care more about the success of the negotiations than his assignment required made it necessary to maintain greater distance from all participants, especially from Queen Zelara, whose combination of intelligence, dedication, and underlying compassion made every interaction feel more personally significant than diplomatic protocol should allow. His solution was deliberate avoidance, ensuring that his duties kept him at maximum distance from the Queen's position during formal sessions, arranging his schedule to minimize opportunities for extended conversation during breaks, and maintaining the kind of professional politeness that acknowledged her authority while avoiding the deeper discussions that had characterized their earlier interactions. The strategy worked from a protocol standpoint, preserving the neutral distance necessary for effective facilitation while preventing personal feelings from influencing his professional judgment. But David was increasingly aware that his behavior was being noticed and interpreted by other members of both delegations, creating political complications that threatened to undermine the careful diplomatic balance he was trying to preserve. He had no way of knowing that Queen Zelara was interpreting his avoidance as evidence of either personal disrespect or institutional discomfort with Vorthak leadership, or that her growing confusion about his behavior was affecting her confidence in human commitment to the negotiation process. But as the ceasefire extension discussions continued, and David maintained his strategy of professional distance, he began to sense that his attempts to avoid complications were themselves becoming the source of complications that could prove more damaging to the peace process than the personal feelings he was trying to conceal. The ceasefire negotiations revealed subtle complexities that David's liaison training helped him recognize, but didn't provide clear guidance for resolving. During discussions of resource sharing agreements in the contested Tau Ceti system, certain advisors from both delegations seemed more concerned about limiting Queen Zelara's access to specific information than about achieving comprehensive resolution of territorial disputes. The mining survey data from the outer system appears to have significant gaps, Queen Zelara observed during her review of the proposed economic cooperation framework. Several key assessments that were referenced in preliminary reports are missing from the documentation provided to this negotiation. David noted that the comment triggered urgent whispered consultations among both human and Vorthak officials, while the Queen's luminous markings shifted to patterns that suggested increased suspicion rather than routine information processing. Technical documentation gaps are unfortunately common in complex territorial analyses, replied General Morrison from the human military delegation, his tone carrying diplomatic courtesy that didn't quite conceal evasive intent. I'm confident that any missing materials can be located in appropriate archives if their inclusion becomes essential for comprehensive evaluation. The exchange was procedurally correct and diplomatically polite, but David's experience with negotiation dynamics flagged it as the kind of careful non-response that usually indicated participants were avoiding discussions they preferred not to have. Queen Zelara's growing awareness that information was being deliberately withheld created tension that affected her interactions with all human representatives, including David, whose pattern of avoidance she was beginning to interpret as evidence that even the supposedly neutral facilitators were participating in whatever conspiracy was limiting her access to complete documentation. Your liaison officer seems uncomfortable with extended interaction, observed Minister Velkara during a private consultation between Queen Zelara and her senior advisors. His behavior suggests either personal discomfort with Vorthak leadership or institutional policies that discourage genuine cooperation, despite public commitment to peace. I had noticed his avoidance, Queen Zelara replied, her markings shifting through patterns that David would have recognized as confusion mixed with disappointment if he'd been present to observe them. Initially, I attributed his distance to appropriate professional boundaries, but the pattern has become too consistent to represent mere diplomatic protocol. David's deliberate maintenance of maximum distance during formal sessions was becoming increasingly obvious to other participants, while his careful scheduling to avoid extended interaction during breaks was creating the impression that human commitment to the negotiations was less genuine than publicly claimed. Perhaps direct inquiry would clarify his intentions, suggested strategic advisor Kethmorn, whose own suspicions about human negotiating strategies had been growing throughout the ceasefire discussions. If Officer Park's avoidance stems from personal disrespect, that information would be valuable for evaluating the sincerity of human diplomatic efforts. The confrontation came during an evening break when diplomatic protocols were relaxed, and most negotiators had dispersed for private consultations. David was reviewing communication logs in the platform's observation deck when Queen Zelara approached with the kind of purposeful directness that suggested she was prepared for honest conversation rather than diplomatic ceremony. "Officer Park," she said, her voice carrying formal courtesy mixed with underlying steel, "I require clarification about your behavior during these negotiations." David looked up from his work, immediately recognizing that Queen Zelara's approach represented exactly the kind of personal interaction he'd been trying to avoid. "Your Majesty, if there are procedural concerns about my facilitation services, I'm happy to address them through appropriate diplomatic channels." "This is not about procedural concerns," Queen Zelara replied, her luminous markings shifting to patterns that David was learning to interpret as controlled frustration. "This is about why you keep avoiding me." The directness of the question cut through all the careful diplomatic language that had governed their interactions, demanding honesty that could either clarify the misunderstandings that had been complicating the negotiations or create new problems that could derail the entire peace process. David considered his options: continue the evasive responses that had been protecting his professional neutrality, provide some diplomatically acceptable explanation that would satisfy the Queen without revealing his personal feelings, or tell the truth about motivations that were becoming impossible to conceal through strategic avoidance. "Your Majesty," he said finally, exhaustion with political calculation overwhelming his caution about personal revelation. I avoid you because being close to you makes me want peace more than war, and that kind of personal investment in outcomes could compromise my objectivity in facilitating negotiations that require neutral judgment rather than emotional advocacy. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to affect the platform's gravitational systems. Queen Zelara stared at him with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been wonder, while her luminous markings began shifting through patterns that were more complex and purposeful than anything David had observed during the negotiations. "You avoid me," she said slowly, "because proximity makes you care too much about success." "I avoid you because proximity makes me care about you," David replied, his honesty becoming complete despite every professional instinct that warned against personal revelation during diplomatic proceedings. "And caring about you makes me want these negotiations to succeed for reasons that go beyond policy analysis and strategic assessment." Queen Zelara's markings blazed with patterns that seemed to tell stories David couldn't interpret, while her expression suggested that his admission had triggered responses that extended far beyond simple personal revelation. "David Park," she said, his name carrying ceremonial weight that transformed their informal conversation into something that felt like a formal declaration. "Your honesty activates the bond of truth. By acknowledging sincere intention without calculation for personal advantage, you have created a connection that cannot be dissolved through political convenience." David felt his understanding of the situation shift dramatically as he realized that his attempt to explain his avoidance had somehow triggered the very cultural mechanisms he'd been trying to avoid through strategic distance. The bond of truth, an ancient law that recognizes genuine commitment to shared principles, creating spiritual and legal connections between those who demonstrate authentic dedication to purposes larger than personal interest. Queen Zelara's voice carried formal authority that suggested she was quoting from memory rather than explaining casual cultural concepts. "By admitting that your feelings for me strengthen your commitment to peace rather than compromise it, you have proven that personal connection can serve truth rather than undermine it." As emergency protocols began activating throughout the platform, in response to bioluminescent patterns that indicated a member of Vorthak royalty had just activated ancient bonding laws with a human, David realized that his strategy of avoiding complications through emotional distance had just created the most significant complication in the history of human-Vorthak relations. "Your Majesty," he said, processing implications that seemed to multiply faster than his ability to understand them, "what exactly does the bond of truth require of us?" Queen Zelara's smile was radiant enough to activate the observation deck's emergency lighting systems. "It requires us to prove that honesty creates stronger foundations for peace than the careful deception that others have been using to prevent it," she replied. And David realized that his simple admission of personal feelings had just become the catalyst for either achieving lasting peace or destroying the most important diplomatic initiative in human history. The activation of the bond of truth triggered immediate responses throughout the Nexus arbitration platform, with security systems from both species recognizing the unprecedented situation, while political advisors attempted to determine whether the ancient Vorthak bonding law represented an opportunity or a crisis that could invalidate the entire negotiation process. "Let me understand this correctly," Ambassador Williams said during the emergency briefing that had been convened in a secure conference room whose privacy systems ensured confidentiality, while cultural experts attempted to explain the implications of David's honest admission. "Our liaison officer has activated an ancient Vorthak law that creates permanent bonds between individuals who demonstrate sincere commitment to shared principles. And this bond now grants him legal standing as Queen Zelara's truth witness in all." "That's an accurate summary of the immediate legal implications," David replied, though he was acutely aware that the clinical description missed the emotional complexity of his situation with Queen Zelara. Though I should clarify that the bonding was triggered by my attempt to explain why I'd been maintaining professional distance, not by any intention to influence the diplomatic process. Intentions aside, the bond of truth has created a situation where our supposedly neutral facilitator now has formal standing within the Vorthak delegation, observed General Morrison, whose expression suggested he was calculating strategic implications rather than diplomatic complications. That connection could provide valuable intelligence about Vorthak decision-making processes and strategic priorities. It could also invalidate any agreements we reach if other parties claim that personal relationships have compromised the objectivity of the negotiation process. Dr. Chen pointed out, consulting cultural databases that painted the bond of truth as both a diplomatic opportunity and a potential disaster. David looked around the briefing room at officials, whose expressions ranged from concern to barely concealed calculation, understanding that his personal feelings about Queen Zelara were now secondary to the political implications of their ancient bonding. The bond of truth wasn't designed to serve strategic advantage, David said firmly. It recognizes authentic commitment to shared principles. Using the connection it creates for intelligence gathering would violate both Vorthak cultural law and the honest intentions that activated the bond in the first place. Before the briefing could continue down the path of exploitation versus ethical responsibility, David's communication device chimed with an urgent message from Queen Zelara. David, we must meet immediately. The bond of truth has granted us access to protected information that reveals threats to both our peoples that extend far beyond the territorial disputes we've been negotiating. The meeting took place in a secure chamber within the Vorthak delegation quarters that David's bonded status had granted him access to. A space whose crystalline architecture seemed to respond to their combined presence by creating enhanced privacy fields and security protocols that neither of them could have activated independently. What kind of threats? David asked immediately upon seeing Queen Zelara's expression, which mixed urgency with barely controlled anger. The kind created by officials from both our governments who have been falsifying war reports, suppressing evidence of successful cooperation, and coordinating their efforts to ensure that peace initiatives fail. Queen Zelara replied, activating holographic displays that showed intelligence data David was certain he wasn't supposed to have clearance to see. The bond of truth grants access to protected communication networks so that truth bearers can expose deception that threatens the principles they've committed to defend. David studied the displays, seeing documentation that revealed systematic manipulation of information provided to both negotiating teams. The missing geological surveys, the gaps in economic data, the intelligence reports that suggested continued hostilities, all deliberately altered or suppressed by a conspiracy that includes General Morrison from your delegation and strategic advisor Kethmorn from mine. Queen Zelara finished, her markings shifting to patterns that David was learning to interpret as controlled fury mixed with determined resolve. They profit more from continued territorial disputes than from resolved boundaries that would reduce military expenditures and weapons contracts. The evidence was comprehensive and damning. Communication logs showing coordination between supposedly opposing officials, financial records revealing shared investments in arms manufacturing, and strategic analyses that had been deliberately altered to make peaceful resolution appear impossible while maintaining profitable instability. They're not just sabotaging the negotiations, David realized, understanding the scope of what they were facing. They're using the peace talks as cover for intelligence gathering and strategic positioning that serves private interests rather than governmental policy. Exactly. And the bond of truth gives us the legal standing and spiritual authority necessary to expose their manipulation, while demonstrating that genuine commitment to peace exists despite their efforts to prevent it. Queen Zelara moved closer, and David noticed that the chamber's defensive systems were responding to their proximity by creating enhanced protective protocols. But exposing the conspiracy requires us to formalize the bond of truth through traditional ceremonies that would make our connection permanent and legally unassailable. And if we don't formalize the bond, then we lose the access that proves the conspiracy exists, while leaving ourselves vulnerable to elimination by people who view truth-bearers as threats to profitable operations. Queen Zelara's expression grew serious. The bond of truth protects those who serve honesty over convenience, but only if they're willing to accept the full responsibility that such service requires. David looked at the evidence that would either save or doom the peace negotiations, realizing that his honest admission of personal feelings had created responsibilities that extended far beyond his original assignment as neutral facilitator. "Your Majesty," he said, understanding that his next words would determine not just their personal future, but the fate of negotiations that represented both species' best hope for lasting peace. "If formalizing this bond means we can expose the forces working against peace, while proving that personal commitment strengthens rather than weakens diplomatic integrity, then I'm willing to accept whatever responsibilities that requires." Queen Zelara's smile was radiant enough to activate the chamber's bioluminescent response systems. "David," she said, his name carrying warmth that transcended formal protocol, "I think that honest commitment to shared principles is exactly what the bond of truth was designed to recognize and protect." As emergency alerts began activating throughout the platform, indicating that the conspiracy had realized their communications were being monitored and had decided to accelerate their timeline for destroying the peace process, David realized that his attempt to maintain professional distance had evolved into personal proximity that would either expose the truth or make both him and Queen Zelara permanent targets for elimination. "So," he said, looking at the woman whose intelligence and dedication had made his professional objectivity impossible to maintain, "shall we formalize this ancient bonding ritual while exposing a conspiracy and saving the peace process?" "I can't think of any truth more worth defending," Queen Zelara replied, and David realized that sometimes the most important diplomatic decisions were made not in conference rooms or through careful protocol, but in moments when two people chose to trust each other completely despite every political reason to remain cautious. The conspiracy moved against them during the platform's night cycle, when security protocols were operating on skeleton crews, launching coordinated attacks designed to eliminate both David and Queen Zelara before they could expose the systematic manipulation that had been poisoning the peace negotiations from within both governments. "Multiple security breaches detected," announced the platform's artificial intelligence as emergency systems activated throughout the diplomatic facility. "Armed personnel from both delegations are engaging in unauthorized activities with weapons that should not be present during ceasefire negotiations." David and Queen Zelara were in the process of preparing for the formal bond of truth ceremony when the assault began, surrounded by evidence that would either save or destroy the peace process, while under attack from people who had decided that dead truth-bearers were preferable to living witnesses to their crimes. "They're not waiting for us to complete the bonding ceremony," David observed, watching tactical displays that showed the attacking forces moving with military precision through the platform's corridors. "They've decided to eliminate us before we can broadcast evidence of their coordination. Which means our choice is no longer whether to formalize the bond of truth," Queen Zelara replied, activating defensive systems that David hadn't known existed until their bonding granted him access to Vorthak security protocols. "Our choice is whether to complete the ceremony while under attack, or die separately while the war profiteers succeed in destroying the peace process and resuming profitable hostilities." The formal bonding ceremony was remarkably simple for a ritual with such profound implications. An exchange of vows that acknowledged their mutual commitment to truth and peace, while activating ancient systems that recognized bonds transcending political calculation. As explosions echoed through the platform and attacking forces fought their way through defensive barriers, David and Queen Zelara spoke the words that would bind their fates together permanently, while simultaneously broadcasting evidence of the conspiracy to authorities throughout both civilizations. I pledge my commitment to truth over convenience, to peace over profit, and to honest partnership with Queen Zelara in serving principles larger than personal interest, David said, his voice carrying across communication networks that reached governmental and military authorities throughout human space. I accept the bond of truth as recognition that genuine feelings strengthen, rather than compromise dedication to justice. I accept David Park as truth-bearer and witness, recognizing his honesty as worthy of trust and his commitment as foundation for hope, Queen Zelara replied, her words triggering security protocols that transformed their location into an impregnable sanctuary, while broadcast systems throughout the platform transmitted evidence of the war profiteering conspiracy. I pledge our partnership in proving that personal connection serves truth rather than undermines it. The moment their bonding was complete, the platform's enhanced defensive systems activated with authority that neither the attacking human nor Vorthak forces had anticipated, while emergency communication arrays transmitted documented proof of the conspiracy to news networks and governmental authorities across multiple star systems. "This is Admiral Santos of the Human Defense Fleet," came a transmission from loyal forces responding to the evidence broadcasts. "We have confirmation of the conspiracy allegations and are moving to arrest personnel involved in the unauthorized assault on the Nexus arbitration platform." "This is High Commander Velnara of the Royal Guard," came a parallel response from Vorthak military hierarchy. "The treasonous elements within our delegation are being taken into custody, and we are coordinating with human authorities to ensure the safety of Queen Zelara and her bonded truth-bearer." The peace negotiations that resumed under heavy security resulted in the most comprehensive cooperation agreement in the history of human-Vorthak relations, with David serving as joint truth-bearer and cultural liaison, whose unique position allowed unprecedented transparency in diplomatic proceedings that had previously been hampered by mutual suspicion and strategic deception. The territorial boundaries established in the new accords, Queen Zelara announced during the formal signing ceremony, reflect honest assessment of both species' needs rather than the manipulated information that has poisoned previous negotiations. David Park's role as truth-bearer ensures that future cooperation will be based on verified facts, rather than profitable deceptions. 6 months later, David found himself reviewing reports from the Joint Oversight Commission while serving in his new role as royal consort and truth-bearer, a position that combined personal partnership with institutional responsibility for maintaining honesty in interspecies relations. "The transparency protocols are exceeding all projections," Queen Zelara reported, her role as co-chair of the Human-Vorthak Cooperation Council keeping her busy with integration programs that neither species could have developed independently. "The truth-bearing principles we established are being adopted by diplomatic initiatives throughout this sector of space. Truth-bearing principles that started with me admitting that I'd been avoiding you because proximity made me care too much about success," David replied, still amazed by the trajectory his honest confession had created. "Though I have to admit, serving as institutional guarantor of diplomatic honesty is considerably more complex than neutral facilitation. More complex than you anticipated when you accepted liaison duty. Much more complex, but also more meaningful than I knew was possible," David looked out at the diplomatic center where human and Vorthak negotiators worked together on cooperation projects that served both civilizations. Besides, the company is exceptional. Queen Zelara laughed, her luminous markings shifting to patterns that David had learned to recognize as deep contentment mixed with boundless affection. Even when the company includes a queen whose idea of romantic conversation involves reviewing honesty protocols and transparency verification procedures. Especially then, though I should probably mention that your tendency to solve diplomatic problems by activating ancient truth-bearing laws is keeping our security teams constantly alert for the next crisis. That's what you get for bonding with someone whose royal training emphasized authentic commitment over strategic calculation. Queen Zelara took his hand, her touch warm despite the alien elegance of her luminous markings. Besides, honest admission seemed to work well for us. David looked around their shared office, where impossible partnerships between former liaison officers and alien royalty were creating diplomatic innovations that served truth rather than political convenience. "You know," he said, squeezing her hand gently, "when I started avoiding you to maintain professional neutrality, the most complicated outcome I imagined was maybe having to request reassignment to preserve diplomatic objectivity. And instead, I discovered that avoiding someone because you care about them too much is the least effective strategy for maintaining emotional distance, especially when that someone has ancient truth-detecting abilities that recognize authentic feelings regardless of how carefully you try to conceal them. More complex than routine diplomatic service, much more complex than anything they covered in liaison training, but exactly as complex as it needed to be." David brought her hand to his lips, noting how her markings shifted to configurations that spoke of joy and deep partnership. "Some truths are worth admitting even when they complicate everything you thought you understood about professional boundaries." As they continued their work developing honesty protocols that served transparency rather than manipulation, David reflected on how dramatically his understanding of diplomatic service had evolved. He'd started as someone who facilitated communication between suspicious parties while maintaining careful emotional distance, and somehow become someone who proved that honest personal connection created stronger foundations for peace than the strategic deception that had previously dominated interspecies relations. The work was more complex now, involving legal frameworks that spanned star systems and truth-bearing responsibilities that required constant attention to the difference between facts and convenient fictions. But the fundamental mission remained the same: ensure that communication served understanding rather than manipulation, and that peace could be built on authentic commitment rather than calculated advantage. David Park had always believed that effective diplomacy required careful management of personal feelings to preserve the neutrality necessary for objective facilitation. He just never imagined that the most important diplomatic breakthrough of his career would come from admitting that some people are worth caring about too much to maintain professional distance, and that honest personal investment in outcomes creates stronger motivation for success than the emotional detachment that had been considered essential for effective negotiation. 3 months later, as David watched the formal inauguration of the Human Vorthak Joint Council with Queen Zelara presiding as co-chair while he served as institutional truth-bearer, he marveled at how a simple admission of honest feelings had become the foundation for proving that personal connection strengthens rather than weakens commitment to principles larger than individual interest. "Any regrets about confronting me when you could have accepted my avoidance as appropriate professional boundaries?" David asked as they prepared for the ceremony that would formalize their leadership of the new cooperative institutions. "Only that I didn't do it sooner," Queen Zelara replied, her smile bright enough to power the platform's communication systems. "Though I should mention